Hello, and welcome to A Beginner's Guide to Die Entführung aus dem Serail. So, Die Entführung aus dem Serail translates to the escape from the Seraglio, or harem, which was composed by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and is written in German. This opera is in the classical style, but then again, Mozart has his own distinct style. It is vocally demanding, very clean melodic lines, very symmetrical and mathematical, and there's a good balance between aria and recits, as this particular opera is a Singspiel, or an opera that includes both sung arias and spoken dialogue. This opera is more, if I may quote Jane Austen, light, bright, and sparkling than some of Mozart's later operas, even though it deals with some particularly heavy and tricky themes, which I will come to later in the video. The other notable composition feature in this piece is that Mozart recreates what he perceived as Turkish percussion heavily in the orchestral segments by using piccolos, cymbals, triangles, and bass drums. So, what is the plot of this very unusual and rarely performed opera? Before the opera opens, Constanze and her maid Blondchen and another servant, Pedrillo, are all kidnapped by pirates on the open seas and sold into slavery in Pasha Selim's harem in Turkey. Pasha Selim is utterly taken with Constanze, but she tries to remain faithful to her beloved Belmonte. As the opera opens, Belmonte has now arrived in Turkey looking for Constanze and his two servants to try and rescue them. He and Pedrillo work together to carry out this plan, while all the while trying to foil the efforts of the bullish bodyguard Osmin. So, some historical background about this piece. This was Mozart's first opera for Vienna in 1782, and it was a smash hit. It then became less popular in the 19th century as bel canto and romantic operas became more and more popular, and it has revived a bit in popularity in the 20th and 21st centuries, but it is less regularly performed than some of Mozart's other operas for a variety of possible reasons. It was based on a pre-existing libretto with some circuitous and slightly mysterious origins. Another important fact to note is that the Ottoman Empire had tried to invade Vienna for the final time 100 years prior to this opera's being written, so that anything that would try to replicate what they would have called Moorish culture would have had both a mocking, satirizing tone, as Vienna had proven the victors finally, but at the same time would have had very exotic and slightly fetishized implications, with all of those historical elements working together in this piece, plus the fact that in this opera, Islam is translated through the lens of a white Christian author. Staging this opera would seem problematic to most directors today, such that I would compare staging this opera to staging The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare, in that there are so many religious and cultural implications that staging this opera well can be a very delicate process. However, I would argue that the characterizations of each of these characters in Die Entführung is not always stereotypical or biased towards the West, as one might expect, just as Shylock is not necessarily the villain of The Merchant of Venice. So in terms of special musical moments to be on the lookout for, I have chosen 4 pieces but there are so many wonderful arias and duets and quartets in this opera that it was very hard to pick these four. However, these four each, I think, are excellent examples of one character. So the first character we are going to look at is Belmonte, Constanza's lover who has swept in to try and save the day. And his aria towards the beginning of the opera, O wie ängstlich, or Oh how anxious. And I have linked a clip of this opera down below as performed by Bliss in a concert in 2016. It is complete with subtitles, and he is a marvelous, marvelous tenor. O wie ängstlich talks about precisely what the title suggests, Belmonte's anxiety, both nervousness and dread. Nervousness at the prospect of seeing Constanza again, and dread of what if something has happened to her? What if she has been treated badly? What if she no longer loves me? And it opens with long drawn out phrases ending on unresolved minor chords that really show that fear, that nervousness. Something is unresolved and there's nothing that he can do about it. And you can hear the breathless anxiety that Belmonte harbors in all of the eighth note rests that Mozart throws in every 2 or 3 notes. Klopf mein Lied, bevor les Herz. He can't catch his breath. He can't finish a word for how heavily he's breathing. And as he goes on, describing everything that he's feeling and the torment, the orchestra is playing heavy 16th and sometimes 32nd notes underneath him, showing the pounding of his heart. There is also wonderful lyric imagery and musical imagery. For example, as he has a long break, he hears this long floating melody in the orchestra for about 3 measures and says, "Is that her whisper?" And it sounds like a whisper. And then it goes to quick, short, little 8th note. No, I'm sorry, 32nd note, little 2-note couplets. Buttum, 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 buttum. Is that her sighing? Is that her laughing? Everything the orchestra does mirrors something that he hears, whether it be real or imagined. Now, even though this is wonderful imagery and fantastic music for any tenor to play with, it does raise 2 interesting questions about Belmonte as a character. First of all, is how he is typified as a European in terms of his European decorum can be seen throughout. There are no wild phrases. Everything is kept very close, very tight, and there are no wild crescendos of passion. All the phrases are grouped very neatly together and tied up in nice little bows. And in addition, everything that he is saying that he feels and everything that he is doing can be wonderfully acted. But does that mean that it really is an act? Does he truly love Constanza and care for her welfare? Perhaps. But does he also love playing the romantic hero? Perhaps. Watch it yourself and see what you think. The next aria that I would like to talk about belongs to Blondchen, Constanza's maid, and it is my particular favorite in this opera, and that is Durch Zärtlichkeit und Schmeicheln. I apologize for any of my German pronunciation throughout this video, which translates to, loosely, by tenderness and flattery, or with sweetness and gentleness. Those sorts of ideas. I have attached a clip of this piece down below as well as sung by Mari Eriksmoen at Glyndebourne in 2015. It is only half the aria, but as many of the pieces in this aria repeat, it gives you a very good overview of all of the points that I am going to make. The reason that I love this aria, and the reason why most people, I think, love this aria, is that it is proto-feminist. It is sticking up for women's rights and autonomy in an age when that wasn't commonly advertised on world stages. The tune itself is very, very sweet. It starts and ends in beautiful A major. Nothing sad, nothing angry, nothing anguished. It is as sweet and gentle and flattering as the title suggests, and that those opening lines form almost a chorus of "by flattery and tenderness is the only way to win a woman's heart." And that melody, which is sung by the soprano, is supported by the orchestra, as if to really underline it or put it in bold. However, there are other pieces in between those snatches of chorus, which we might think of as almost verses. And those verses take a minor key turn to them. Not fully, but it's not as sweet and happy and major key as the previous lines. And when they take that minor key, they become more fierce and more determined. She's not saying anything horrible. She's not insulting him. She's being as sweet and kind and flattering, but you can now tell that sweetness and kindness is held up by a backbone of steel. And in those moments, the orchestra is not playing along with her. They are merely providing punctuation in between everything that she says. So she is much more open and more exposed as a singer, but it's as if the orchestra isn't saying it with her. They're letting her make her argument, but they're putting in little, "Yeah, get it, girl," little shouts of encouragement along the way. Towards the end of the piece, this piece also features some incredible high notes for whichever soprano sings this role, including a high E towards the end. And those high notes, while being sweet and lovely and beautiful, are also piercing enough to brook no argument from Osmin. Even more than this aria itself, the conversation that happens afterwards in dialogue is fascinating between Blondchen and Osmin. Osmin, of course, arguing for the fact that you are a slave. You will do as I tell you. If I command you to love me, you should love me. Why are Englishmen such fools as to allow women to talk this way and behave this way? But Blondchen gives it right back to him every step of the way, proving her point that he cannot bully her into loving him. This whole conversation, while wonderful in and of itself, could also be seen as an Enlightenment argument for women's autonomy, for love matches, conversations that were happening throughout that century, but cleverly presented in the form of a woman making the argument, but almost forcing the audience to agree with her, whether or not they ordinarily would have agreed with a woman. Because if you agreed with Osmin the Turk, you would be agreeing with barbarity. Now, we'll touch the racial implications of that in a moment, but proto-feminism is always a win. Of course, no discussion of Die Entführung is complete without touching on the showpiece of all soprano arias, Martern aller Arten, or All Kinds of Torture. This is an aria which Constanza sings. Constanza is a showpiece role for any soprano. However, she only has 3 major arias throughout the opera, of which this is the last. She, of course, participates in duets throughout the second half of the opera, but this is her big moment. Pasha Selim has been trying to convince her and persuade her to love him through many different methods, and nothing is working. So finally, he snaps, and he threatens her with all kinds of torture. Maybe that will persuade her to give in. And this aria is her response. What makes this aria even more impressive is that it is directly preceded by another long and difficult aria, and is only separated by a short amount of dialogue. So that is a long time on stage. It is a long time of arduous singing for whichever soprano is in the role. I have linked a clip down below of Lisette Oropesa, possibly my favorite soprano, singing this piece in a recent production from 2020 at the Vienna Opera House, or the Vienna State Opera. While that particular production was very strange, in my opinion, I didn't understand a lot of the directorial choices that were made. Lisette sings this aria so beautifully that I had to include it for you all to listen to. So this aria's name, Martern alle Arten, or All Kinds of Torture, is indeed agony to sing. It does not describe just the threat of torture. It could be considered vocal torture to someone who is learning it. There are incredible high notes and incredible low notes. There are octave jumps, incredible long sustained notes towards the end of this 10-minute aria. It is a true marathon of singing. Some important things to note. It is written in 4/4 time, which is the standard beat for a march. And the rhythms that Mozart chooses are very square and on the beat. He does not play with that march-like rhythm at all. So that very square beat helps to show Constanze's conviction that she will not give in. All kinds of torture do not frighten me. I laugh at them. They will do nothing to me. And indeed, he throws in some more musical imagery, as he did in Belmonte's arias. There are incredible melismas in this piece. And melismas are better known as runs in the vernacular, but runs of notes, up and down scales, up and down. And I will include a picture here so you can see what I am talking about. And these must be performed all in one breath because they fall in the middle of a word. And that word is velachen, or laugh. It is in the middle of the phrase where Constanze says, I laugh at pain and torture. And after those melismas, she gets short little 16 and 1/8 note triplets, ba-da-bum, 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 which sounds like descending laughter. That is how you justify it as a singer and as an actor. You listen to it and you think about what does it sound like and how does it pair with the text that I am singing. It's on the word laugh. So it literally sounds like laughter. However, no aria can sustain being staunchly defiant for an entire 10 minutes, because that would be boring to listen to. So in the middle, Constanze tries a second technique, which is soft pleading for mercy. If you have mercy on me, heaven will reward you. But when that doesn't work either, the staunch square melodies return with long sustained notes, again signifying that will of iron that Constanze has, with an allegro beat and all sorts of crescendos, high C's and D's flung in throughout, but ending on a downward trend. It doesn't end on a screaming high note. It goes from high G to high C, C5, I think. The one above middle C, to show that this is not an exclamation, it is not a question, this is a statement, this is a vow. And again, even though the orchestra is playing furiously underneath, for much of her aria, Constanze is very exposed. And the orchestra is letting her declaim and backs her up to the hilt. Much as all of that combined would make for a showstopper aria. The true test of any production is how much it lets Constanze and Selim explore their own feelings and potentially their feelings for each other. That is one thing that makes each production of Die Entführung fascinating, is to what extent do Constanze and Pasha Selim really care for each other, or at least are attracted to each other. So some questions that I would ask you to think about if you investigate any of these productions is to think about who claims to be in control in this section, who is actually in control in this section, who is telling the truth, who is lying, And to whom are they lying? And you can get some really wonderful character analysis from those questions. The final moment that I always enjoy in Die Entführung is the aria O wie will ich triumphieren, which is sung by Osmin, the bodyguard, which loosely translates to Oh, how I will triumph. So slight spoiler alert here, Osmin has caught the lovers trying to escape and is sending them back to the Pasha to await their fate, and is relishing in his moment of glory. And he cannot wait to see them subjected to torture and eventually execution and earn his praise from the Pasha. Now, Osmin is probably the most stereotypical character in this entire production, and he embodies all of the perceived rage and violence and injustice inherent in the East, particularly in Muslim countries, as was seen by the West at that point. And you could make the case that some people still see Islamic countries that way, which is why this is a piece that has not yet finished saying everything it has to say. This aria grabs you immediately with its furious, wild melody, driven at a breakneck pace by the orchestra, which of course mirrors the perceived wild and furious nature of the Turk. Osmin relishes in violence. He is very much masochistic. However, this piece is a showpiece for the bass, of which there are not many in the operatic repertoire. There are incredible sustained low notes, which are just as much of a challenge for lower voices as high notes are for higher voices, and all sorts of crazy melismas and jumps that he must navigate in a very short amount of time at a breakneck speed, whilst performing all kinds of choreography. This aria could also be seen as a jumping off point to explore Osmin's jealousy. I see his jealousy as an almost Iago-like jealousy, in that he is rejoicing in the pain and the deaths of those who he sees as getting in the way of his glory. And so thus, by causing their downfall, he will get what he deserves. I would encourage you to take a listen to the clip that I have included, which is of Tobias Kehrer, also from the Glyndebourne 2015 production. Before I end and send you off to watch this production for yourself, I would introduce one other major point, which is that of Pasha Selim himself, who is an incredibly interesting operatic character, in that he never sings a note. Pasha Selim is only a speaking role, and there are many questions as to why is that? Well, I would argue, and I have heard argued by others, that the reason for this is because he is quite a slippery character to get a hold of. Let me explain. He seems to veer back and forth between stereotypical violent Muslim ruler and enlightened ruler who would be seen more kindly in the West. He is also, as you discover, a former captive and a convert to Islam, meaning that he was once Christian, which for an 18th century audience would have been very difficult to wrap their heads around. And thus he has both of those religious philosophies embedded somewhere in his psyche. Whether or not he acknowledges them being there or not, they are lurking somewhere. So thus he is caught between the East and the West. So what would a character like that sound like musically? I think it would be very difficult to put on paper, and I think that could be why Mozart didn't. And a last question to think about is, does Pasha Selim embody the messages of tolerance and justice and virtue? Or do all of the characters do that? Give this production a watch, and I'll let you be the judge. If you are looking for versions of this production to watch, there are relatively few. However, I would highly recommend the 2015 production from Glyndebourne, of which 3 of the 4 clips that I have included are from. And I think the characterization was very well done. I think it's very thought-provoking. And the set design and the costuming are beautiful. The costuming, to my eye, seems very accurate to the 18th century, or at least the costuming on the Western characters seems to be. The Eastern costumes also seem to be relatively accurate based on the little that I know, or at least do not seem to be incredibly far-fetched or stereotypical. And the set design is truly stunning. It reminds me very much of the Mezquita in Cordoba, Spain, which was one of my favorite places to visit when I lived in Spain. If you're not aware, the Mezquita was a mosque in Muslim-ruled southern Spain, which, when the Reconquest happened, was turned back into a cathedral, but much of the mosque's original architecture was left untouched. So it's a very interesting combination of Eastern and Western architecture, and they mirror that very, very well in this set design, which I really enjoy. So go ahead and give that a listen. I hope that I have inspired you to listen to this production, especially today, when this airs, is the day after Mozart's birthday, January 27th. And I will see you again in the future for another beginner's guide to opera. Until then, be safe, be well, and happy listening. Bye, everyone.